Hello, everybody. Racism in this country has been largely a binary issue, and in the past has been mostly between white Americans and black Americans. But in the 20th and 21st century, there's been a wave of immigration to the country, and it's kind of created the US to be a melting pot, and specifically Asian Americans. Asian Americans and black Americans both face racism in this country and do in the present day. But Asian Americans have this privilege, and this privilege kind of started in the system of immigration. But Asian Americans use this privilege to kind of hide and detach themselves from the racism in this country. And instead of the detachment, Asian Americans should use the privilege and acknowledge the roots of it to unify with the black community and fight against oppression. Black Americans have faced racism in the country through the past and in the present. In the past, obviously, with slavery, Black Americans have faced so much discrimination. And after slavery, in the 1960s and 1970s, it was really hard for Black Americans to get jobs. People were discriminating them. And this kind of caused generations of poverty. And in these poverty filled neighborhoods, there's really bad school systems that don't prioritize education. They don't prioritize rigorous classes. They don't prioritize college. They say, we're just trying to make you not be a criminal. You know, they're not set up for success like we are here. And there's statistics to show that Caucasians and Asian Americans go to way better schools than African Americans, just setting them up for failure. And then, more recently, cops. There's been so much exposure to the racism that cops have against African Americans. Statistics also prove that Black Americans are more likely to die when encountering a cop in basic arrests. Just like a traffic stop, nobody should die. But there is statistics to prove that. Asian Americans have also faced racism in this country. With World War II, the Japanese were called the undesirable race. They were alienized. They were excluded. Then more recently, with 9/11, brown people, just all brown people, were looked at as terrorists, and people were afraid and hated people that were brown. And obviously, I'm brown myself, and my family, we're a brown family. And I noticed that when we would go to airports, it was very obvious that my dad was stopped more than anybody else, and he was always checked in these random searches, but they weren't so random. So there's been tons and tons of racism. And then obviously today with COVID-19, there's been so much racism against Asian Americans, specifically Chinese Americans. There's been hateful acts, hateful terms thrown around by politicians in this country. So there's been tons and tons of hate. But though there is this racism, there's also this privilege that Asian Americans have. This privilege kind of started in the system of immigration. So Asian immigrants, a lot of them came to this country through, a work visa or through school or through family relations, because it's not easy to immigrate to the US. It's actually very hard. So the immigrants that were coming here were, of a little bit of higher quality. They came here to work. They came here through IT, engineering, medical. So they came here for a reason. And they came here with big families. And obviously, if you can send your child across the world, you must be from a family that values education, that has good values, or obviously is somewhat wealthy. It's not, the plane tickets to come here are not cheap. So the immigrants that were coming here were hardworking. And there was kind of a good quality of them. And then with the Immigration and Naturalization Acts of 1965, this act only attracted skilled laborers to the US, and it was used by politicians in opposition of the civil rights movement. And politicians used this to say to African Americans, look at these Asian immigrants that are coming, that are, skilled, and look how successful they are. But this wasn't entirely true, because the group of immigrants that was coming is not the whole. It was obviously good quality of immigrants that were coming. So this privilege kind of started building. Americans put Asians on kind of a pedestal and were like, hey, look, they're kind of successful. They respected them because of what they were doing. But this privilege is rooted in the racism. It's kind of saying that you guys are both minorities, but look, you guys are better, maybe. You guys are doing better, but that's not necessarily true. So this privilege, Asian Americans kind of used it, and they hid. And they decided, okay, I'm just going to, ignore the racism, and I'm going to use this privilege and kind of ignore the problems in this country. So it caused this detachment between the two communities. My parents, they immigrated to this country. They were both 19 and 20 when they immigrated. And my dad, he came here and he lived with his huge family. He came and stayed with his uncle and his 5 sisters. So he had a great support system. And then my mom later moved, through marriage. So they came here and they had support and a family. And when immigrants come to this country, America, is seen as the land of opportunity, and it's seen as kind of a lotto ticket if you get to come. So often, immigrants, and specifically Asian immigrants, are kind of blinded to the problems in this country. They don't even want to look at them because they kind of see like all the goods. And how can you look at the bad? You kind of ignore it if there's so much good. So that was really common in a lot of Asian immigrants. But then, more recently, with George Floyd, it kind of became hard to ignore what was happening in this country. It was all over the news. So George Floyd was a man that was killed um, over a counterfeit $20 bill, I believe, and he was murdered, and his arrest was taken to the extreme. And he repeatedly said, I can't breathe," but he was killed. And this caused outrage throughout the country. In all 50 states, 60 countries, and all 7 continents, there were protests fighting for Black Lives Matter. The death of George Floyd brought the deaths of Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, and so many more to light. Um, and Asian Americans saw this, but most of them felt, like this was inapplicable to them. And they felt like they couldn't relate to it because Asian Americans aren't necessarily afraid of talking to the cops because they're Asian. Obviously, no one loves talking to the cops, but it wasn't because of their race. So they felt like they couldn't relate to this. But throughout the year, I feel like more Asian Americans kind of woke up to their privilege. Asian Americans are called the model minority, and I learned through social media that this term model minority is not a good term. It's kind of saying, hey, you're the model, but you're still a minority. So it's kind of saying that you're not equal. We don't see you as equal, but you're okay, I guess. And so that's not a good thing. And I think a lot of Asian Americans realize this. And through platforms like Instagram and Twitter, I saw so much and I learned so much through resources that influencers were posting, like donation sites, numbers to call, petitions to sign. There was so much exposure to this specifically this year. And my parents learned a lot, and they decided that it's time to stand up and it's time to accept what's going on in this country and no more being blinded. So my parents decided to go to a protest. They attended one with me, and they decided that it's time to not be silent. It's time to make change. And many Asian Americans realize this, but many need to still realize this. And as Kamala Harris said, she said, "Our unity is our strength, and our diversity is our power." And this really resonates with the marginalized communities in America. We need to unify and fight against change instead of kind of using maybe our differences to separate, because our differences make us stronger. So Asian Americans need to stop being silent and using their privilege to kind of hide away. They need to recognize the roots of their privilege and fight with the Black community against oppression and fight for change. Thank you.